The glass was already rising to her lips when the boy's voice shattered the silence of the garden. "Ma'am, please don't drink that." Every head at the luncheon turned. Crystal stemware froze midair. The soft murmur of old money conversation died as if someone had pressed mute on the entire world. Lena Blake, her hand still cradling the gentle swell of her pregnant belly, held the tea glass suspended just inches from her mouth. Her eyes found the source of the interruption, a small boy, perhaps 8 years old, in clothes that had been washed so many times they had forgotten their original color. He stood at the edge of the white tablecloth like a ghost who had wandered in from another dimension entirely. And he was pointing. His small finger trembled as it aimed directly at the glass in her hand. Howard Blake rose from his chair with the swift, controlled fury of a man who had built a billion-dollar empire by never allowing chaos to touch him. His face had gone from surprised to annoyed to absolutely livid in the span of a single heartbeat. Security personnel were already moving through the crowd, their dark suits cutting toward the table like sharks sensing blood in the water. The boy didn't run. He didn't flinch. He just kept pointing at that glass, his entire body shaking, his eyes locked on the tea with an intensity that seemed far too old for his young face. "This isn't your place," Howard snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. He gestured dismissively toward the child. "Get him out of here, now." But the boy's gaze never wavered. Even as the security guards reached for his thin shoulders, even as the whispers of scandalized guests rippled through the garden like poison, he kept his finger aimed at that glass of tea. And in his eyes, in those dark, haunted eyes, there was something that didn't make sense. It wasn't defiance, it wasn't fear. It was memory. How did a poor, ragged child end up at the most exclusive luncheon in the city? What could he possibly know about a simple glass of tea? And why did he look like he was staring at something far more terrifying than a billionaire's wrath? The answer to those questions is more shocking than you can imagine. If you believe that a single moment can reveal a person's true character, hit that subscribe button and join us, because you are about to witness one of those moments. To understand the horrifying truth behind that scene, to understand why that little boy's warning would bring a titan of industry to his knees, we have to go back to the beginning. To a perfect spring afternoon when the world made sense, when power meant safety, and when Howard Blake still believed he was the smartest person in any room he entered. The Ashford Garden was the kind of restaurant where reservations were not simply made, but earned. Nestled behind a wrought iron gate on the city's most exclusive street, its outdoor dining terrace was a sanctuary of old money and new influence. Waiters in crisp white jackets moved between tables with the silent precision of trained dancers. The air smelled of jasmine and fresh-cut herbs, and the afternoon sunlight filtered through perfectly trimmed hedges, casting everything in a golden, dreamlike glow. Howard Blake had chosen this location deliberately. The charity luncheon he was hosting, a carefully curated gathering of tech investors, philanthropists, and city officials, was as much about displaying his success as it was about raising funds. Every detail had been considered. The menu, sourced from organic farms he partially owned. The wine, from a vineyard he had invested in the previous year. Even the table linens had been selected to match the exact shade of white from his company's branding. He surveyed the gathering with the quiet satisfaction of a king observing his court. At 52, Howard Blake had built a reputation as the man who could see what others couldn't. He had predicted the mobile revolution before smartphones existed. He had invested in renewable energy when the world was still addicted to oil. Every decision he made, every instinct he followed, had been proven right by time and profit. And he had grown comfortable with being right, perhaps too comfortable. His wife Lena sat beside him, one hand resting protectively on her pregnant belly. At 38, this was their first child, a miracle the doctors had called it after years of trying. The pregnancy had softened something in Howard, cracked open a door to a tenderness he hadn't known he possessed, but it had also heightened his need for control. He found himself scanning rooms for threats, analyzing situations for risk, protecting Lena with a vigilance that bordered on obsession. She was the opposite of him in many ways. Where Howard was sharp edges and cold calculation, Lena was warmth and intuition. She had been a children's book illustrator before they met, and she still approached the world with an artist's eye, noticing the play of light on water, the sadness behind a stranger's smile, the stories that lived in small details. She saw what Howard often missed, the human element. Today, she was radiant in a pale blue dress that flowed around her like water. Her honey blonde hair was pulled back softly, and her blue eyes reflected the afternoon light with a peaceful contentment. She was listening to the wife of a city councilman talk about a hospital renovation project, but her attention kept drifting to the edge of the garden where the manicured grounds met the iron fence. Beyond that fence lay a small public park, a strip of green that served the less fortunate neighborhoods nearby. Children played there sometimes, their laughter floating over the barrier like music from another world. And today, as she glanced toward it, she noticed a small figure standing at the fence. A boy alone, watching. He wasn't playing. He wasn't moving. He simply stood there, his fingers wrapped around the iron bars, his dark eyes studying the garden with an intensity that seemed impossible for a child his age. His clothes were worn, a faded t-shirt, jeans that had been patched at the knees, sneakers that had seen better days. But his posture wasn't the slouch of a beggar or the fidget of a troublemaker. He stood perfectly still, like a scientist observing an experiment. Lena felt something stir in her heart, a maternal pull, a question. But then the councilman's wife said something that required a response, and she turned back to the conversation, the boy at the fence slipping from her conscious mind. She would remember him later. She would remember that she had seen him first. The tea arrived at precisely 2:30. A young waiter, new to the staff, Lena noticed. By the nervous way he handled the tray, set the glass before her with a small flourish. Iced jasmine tea with lemon, the house specialty, recommended by the manager himself for pregnant women seeking a gentle, caffeine-free refreshment. It looked beautiful, pale gold liquid, a slice of lemon floating gracefully, condensation beading on the glass. Except, something was wrong with the condensation. Lena noticed it the way an artist notices when a color is slightly off. The glass should have been frosted with cold, rivulets of water running down its sides. Instead, the moisture sat oddly, thin, incomplete, as if the glass couldn't decide whether it was cold or warm. And the lemon. It had sunk to the bottom of the glass in a way that seemed strange, though she couldn't articulate why. She lifted the glass and a faint metallic scent reached her nose. Not strong, not alarming, just present, like a whisper of something that shouldn't be there. "Everything all right, darling?" Howard asked, his attention pulled momentarily from a conversation with a venture capitalist. Lena hesitated. The concerns felt foolish. She was in one of the finest restaurants in the country, surrounded by wealth and expertise. Who was she to question a glass of tea? "Fine," she said, and began to raise the glass to her lips. That was when the boy appeared. Later, the security team would piece together how it happened. A service gate at the far end of the garden had been left ajar while delivery trucks unloaded supplies. The child had slipped through with the silent ease of someone who had spent his life moving unnoticed through spaces where he didn't belong. By the time anyone spotted him, he was already at the Blake table, standing like a small, ragged ghost amid the sea of silk and linen. And he spoke those words that stopped time itself. "Ma'am, please don't drink that." The garden went silent, every conversation halted, every eye turned. Howard's reaction was instantaneous. He rose from his chair, his face flushing with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. A child, a poor child by the look of him, had breached his carefully constructed world, had interrupted his event, had dared to address his wife. "Who let him in here?" Howard demanded, his voice carrying across the terrace. "Security." The boy didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on the glass of tea, his finger still pointing, his small body trembling with an emotion that seemed to go far beyond the present moment. "Sir, I'm so sorry," the manager began, rushing forward. "Get him out," Howard interrupted. "This is a private event. This isn't some public park where—" "Howard," Lena's voice was soft but firm. She hadn't put down the glass, but she hadn't drunk from it either. Something in the boy's eyes had caught her attention, that same intensity she had noticed at the fence, that strange, knowing stillness. "Wait." Howard turned to her, incredulous. "Lena, the child is clearly—" "Why?" Lena asked, looking directly at the boy. Her voice was gentle, curious, free of the condescension that dripped from everyone else's gaze. "Why shouldn't I drink it?" The security guards had reached the table now, their hands hovering near the boy's shoulders, waiting for the signal to remove him. Guests were whispering behind their hands. The manager looked like he might have a stroke, and Howard was glaring at his wife with a mixture of confusion and frustration that she had never seen before. But the boy spoke. His voice was small, almost a whisper, but in the silence of the garden, every word was crystal clear. "My mom used to clean tables like this. She taught me something." He swallowed, his throat working as if the words were physically difficult to produce. "If the lemon sinks too fast and there's no condensation on the glass the right way, it means something's wrong. It's been sitting too long, or something got mixed in." Howard let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. "You're telling me a child who probably can't even read, knows more about food safety than a five-star restaurant." He looked around at the other guests, inviting them to share in his incredulity. "This is absurd. Remove him." But Lena wasn't laughing. She was looking at the glass in her hand, at the lemon resting on the bottom, at the strange, thin moisture on the outside, at the faint shimmer of something she couldn't name floating in the liquid. She set the glass down. "What else did your mother teach you?" she asked quietly. The boy's eyes finally lifted from the glass to meet hers, and in those dark depths, Lena saw something that made her blood run cold. She saw grief, old grief, the kind of grief that carves itself into a person's soul and never leaves. "She got sick once," the boy said. His voice was barely audible now, a sound meant only for her. "From old tea, from a glass that wasn't cleaned right. They didn't know until it was too late." He paused. A single tear traced its way down his dust-smudged cheek. "She never woke up." The words hung in the air like a knife suspended mid-fall. Howard's face went through a rapid series of transformations, from anger to confusion to something he couldn't quite name. The security guards froze, their hands still hovering, suddenly uncertain of their purpose. And Lena felt something shift in her chest, a maternal recognition that transcended logic or reason. This child wasn't playing games. He wasn't looking for money or attention. He was trying, with everything he had, to prevent his own nightmare from happening to someone else. She turned to the manager, her voice no longer gentle but sharp with sudden, cutting authority. "Test the tea." And there it was, the horrifying possibility. Lena's world tilted on its axis, and Howard, for the first time in as long as he could remember, felt the ground shift beneath his feet. But the story doesn't end here. The most important part, the part that shows what a man is truly made of, is what happens next. Before we continue, comment below with what you would do in the father's shoes. We read every single one. The next 20 minutes were the longest of Howard Blake's life. The manager had gone pale at Lena's command but moved quickly, taking the glass with gloved hands to the kitchen, where a staff member with chemistry training kept emergency testing supplies. Howard found himself unable to sit. He paced the edge of the terrace, his mind racing through scenarios, each one worse than the last. The boy, Caleb, they had learned his name from the soft words he exchanged with Lena while they waited, sat in a chair that had been offered to him by a waiter who seemed to have forgotten the class distinctions that usually governed his behavior. He looked impossibly small in the oversized garden furniture, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes still fixed on the table where the glass had been. Lena sat beside him, not touching him but close enough that he could feel her presence. She asked him quiet questions. Where did he live? With a foster family a few blocks from the park. How old was he? 8. Did he come to the fence often? Sometimes. When his foster siblings were fighting, and he needed quiet. Howard listened to these exchanges from a distance, his throat tight with something he couldn't identify. He watched his wife, his pregnant, vulnerable, precious wife, treating this street child with the same dignity she would offer a visiting dignitary. He watched the boy respond to her kindness like a flower turning toward unexpected sunlight. And he felt, for the first time in many years, like he was seeing himself from the outside, like he was watching a stranger, a cold, dismissive, arrogant stranger, and finding that stranger wanting. The manager returned. His face told the story before his words did. He was white as the tablecloths, his hands shaking so badly that he had to clasp them together to keep them still. "Mr. Blake," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "the tea was contaminated." Howard felt his knees weaken. What? A cleaning chemical, industrial strength. A new staff member was sanitizing the glassware this morning and he used the wrong solution, didn't rinse properly. The residue, the manager swallowed hard. For most people it would cause mild stomach upset at worst, but for a pregnant woman, especially in the second trimester. He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Howard's hands went numb. The sounds of the garden, the whispers, the distant traffic, the birds in the hedges, faded to a dull roar. All he could hear was his own heartbeat, pounding in his ears like a drum of judgment. A cleaning chemical, in his wife's tea, in the drink that would have gone straight to his unborn child. And the only person who had noticed, the only person in this entire garden full of educated, successful, observant people, was an 8-year-old boy in patched jeans who had learned to read glasses from his dead mother. Howard turned slowly to look at Caleb. The boy was still sitting in that too-large chair, his eyes now lowered, his small hands still folded. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't look proud. He looked like someone who had been carrying an unbearable weight for years and had finally been able to use it to save someone else. And Howard understood, in a flash of clarity that hit him like a physical blow, what he had almost done. He had almost silenced this child. He had almost had him dragged away like garbage. He had almost ignored the only warning that would have saved his family, because that warning came from a source he had deemed unworthy of his attention. His wealth, his power, his famous instincts, all of it had been useless, worse than useless. His arrogance had nearly cost him everything. Howard Blake stepped away from the table. He walked toward the edge of the terrace, where the jasmine bushes created a wall of fragrant green, and he did something he hadn't done since his own father's funeral 30 years earlier. He wept. The tears came from somewhere deep, somewhere he had built walls around for decades. They weren't just tears of relief, though relief was certainly there. They were tears of shame, of recognition, of a sudden, devastating awareness of who he had become and who he had failed to be. He had built towers of glass and steel. He had moved markets with a word. He had been on the covers of magazines as a visionary, a genius, a prophet of the future. And he had nearly lost his child because he didn't listen to one. In the days that followed, Howard Blake moved with a new kind of purpose. He learned that Caleb's mother had died 3 years earlier from complications stemming from food poisoning, a contaminated drink at a restaurant where she worked as a cleaner. The restaurant had been shuttered after an investigation, but the damage was done. Caleb, orphaned, had been bounced between foster homes ever since, carrying his mother's warnings like sacred scripture, seeing danger in glasses and plates that others never thought to examine. He learned that Caleb had no living relatives, that his foster situation was unstable, that he spent more time watching the world through fences than participating in it, because participation required a trust he no longer possessed. Howard did what came naturally to him. He used his resources. But for the first time in his life, he used them not to build his empire, but to build something else entirely. He established a full educational fund in the name of Maria Torres, Caleb's mother, that would carry the boy through whatever schooling he chose to pursue. He created a restaurant safety scholarship program, funding training for staff at establishments across the city, ensuring that the kind of careless error that had nearly claimed his child would become rarer. He quietly hired several teachers and counselors from Caleb's neighborhood school, giving them positions overseeing community outreach programs with salaries that would change their lives. But it was the last thing Howard did that mattered most. One week after the luncheon, Howard Blake returned to the park where Caleb often sat. He found the boy on a bench, watching the Ashford garden through the iron fence, his legs swinging because they couldn't reach the ground. Howard walked over and, without a word, lowered himself to his knees. He knelt there in his $4,000 suit on the dusty ground of a public park, until his eyes were level with the boy's. Caleb looked at him with that same quiet intensity, watching, waiting, uncertain. "I owe you an apology," Howard said. His voice cracked and he didn't try to hide it. "I owe you more than that, but I don't know if there are words big enough." Caleb said nothing. His small hands gripped the edge of the bench. "You saved my family," Howard continued. "My wife, my child. You saved them when no one else could see what you saw, and I almost—" He stopped, the words catching in his throat like broken glass. "I almost threw you away like you didn't matter." The boy's eyes glistened, but he still didn't speak. Howard reached out and gently, carefully, took Caleb's small hand in his own. "You reminded me of something I forgot a long time ago," he said. "That the most important things aren't always loud. That wisdom doesn't come from titles or money. That sometimes the person you need to listen to most is the one everyone else is ignoring." He squeezed the boy's hand gently. "You reminded me what kind of man I forgot to be." For a long moment, they sat there in silence, the billionaire on his knees and the orphan on the bench. Two people from different worlds, connected by a glass of tea and a warning that had changed everything. Then slowly Caleb spoke. "My mom said that kindness is like water," he whispered. "It finds the cracks, even in the hardest walls." Howard closed his eyes as the words washed over him. When he opened them again, they were wet. "Your mother," he said softly, "was the wisest person I've never met." True character isn't revealed by power, but by who you choose to listen to when it costs you nothing to care. In a world that often mistakes volume for value and wealth for wisdom, we are reminded that the most important voices are sometimes the quietest. They belong to those who have suffered, who have learned, who carry their truths not as weapons, but as gifts waiting to be received by anyone humble enough to accept them. Howard Blake went on to become a different kind of investor, one who listened before he acted, who valued insight over status, who never again assumed that his position made him right. And Caleb Torres grew up knowing that his mother's death, while tragic, had given him a power that could save lives. A power that required only that someone be willing to listen. This story reminds us that true wisdom often comes from unexpected places, from the overlooked, the underestimated, the ones who watch from the other side of the fence. If this story resonated with you, and you want more tales that inspire and make you think, make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on. Our next story is about a waitress who receives a lottery ticket as a tip, and the decision she makes will change 3 lives forever. You won't want to miss it.